Latin Disciple early history is indeed fascinating, as they have deep ties to the Gangster disciples and Black disciples that date far back in time. The story begins in the year 1966, the same year several African American street gangs united under the Black Disciple umbrella on the south side of Chicago. Since 1961, disciples were operating in the Cabrini Green public housing projects on Chicago's north side. Devil's Disciples/Black Disciples attended Wells High School and other elementary schools in the area, as that was part of their district. All children from all over West Town also attended the same high school, which is located on the borders of Ukrainian Village, East Humboldt Park and Wicker Park. Young Puerto Rican youths from Rockwell and Potomac in East Humboldt Park attending the same schools as Black disciples soon became influenced by the disciples. These kids had problems with some white greaser gangs in the area like C-Notes, Gaylords, P.V.P and various others. These kids had family members that were Milwaukee Kings and Latin Kings and various others, so they had no beef with Puerto Rican gangs. However, these boys didn't want to join the nearby Latin Kings around Humboldt School. Instead, they were enticed into joining the disciples and to gain entry into the Black Disciple Nation. The youths from Rockwell and Potomac could only gain this entry into the Black Disciples if they were to create their own gang for Hispanics. This is when Latin Disciple was created in 1966. The boys went in different directions. Albert Hernandez was one of the leaders and creators of a Latin Disciple group and simply called his group of young 12-year-olds Latin Disciples. The second group was the Bruce Lee Latin Disciples that was led by Pete the Burner Correa. Down the street more toward Rockwell and Crystal, Jose Freckles Cedeno led the Almighty Latin Disciples. At the beginning there were 3 different Latin Disciple gangs at this intersection. The Disciple Future high-up members were a strong part of this area since the beginning. Future leader Jose Freckles Cedeno's mother owned a corner store right on Rockwell and Potomac named Santa's Store, and the family lived on the first floor in 1967. Jose himself moved on to the second floor with his girlfriend Anna. Edwin Mouse Barrios moved on to the third floor and was also a big-time MLD in later years. The Latin Disciples liked to help out the community at Rockwell and Potomac in the East Humboldt Park neighborhood. The disciples treated many people in the community with respect and would even stick up for people that were being bullied by neighborhood gangs. This led to conflicts with Latin kings, warlords and Spanish lords, not white gangs like Gangland says, especially not Gaylords and Harrison gents that were never in East Humboldt Park. The disciples hung out with the Milwaukee Kings as their closest allies, and the two clubs partied together. During the ferocious blizzard of 1967, the disciples volunteered to shovel snow for people in the community. This got Albert Hernandez and his 11 other disciples pictured in the Chicago Daily News newspaper in 1967, which is the photo that was used for the History Channel's Gangland show. It is surprising that Hernandez was almost 13 years old in that photo. In the year 1968, the Latin Disciples opened the door to more recruitment as they began taking blacks, Mexicans, Polish, German and just about any type of individuals with many backgrounds. Albert Hernandez was charismatic, and being linked to the notorious Devil's Disciples brought more notoriety. Soon disciple numbers would swell to over 100 members at Rockwell and Potomac in the late 60s. This was also the time when Albert Hernandez called for a unity between Latin Disciples, Almighty Latin Disciples and Bruce Lee Disciples to create one nation known as Latin Disciples. Albert Hernandez was then appointed as the leader of the Latin Disciples and was regarded as a king. In the late 1960s, the Latin Disciples befriended the Spanish Cobras as they moved on to Maplewood and Division. This was the beginning of a very close relationship with the Cobras that would eventually evolve into one of the most bitter rivalries in Chicago history. On the day of January 18, 1972, Albert Hernandez was out at Rockwell and Potomac as usual when Latin King gang members came into the neighborhood and were harassing one of the Polish members of the LDs. Hernandez was doing what he did best and sticking up for others, and this is what led to those Latin Kings pulling a knife and stabbing him to death. Albert Hernandez was killed a few months before turning 18. He left a legacy that was heavily admired, but his legacy was also turned into more than it really was. Albert Hernandez was born on April 5, 1954 and died on January 18, 1972. Hernandez was said to be a big reader of Adolf Hitler because he admired the dictator's play for power. In reality, there was no known interest Hernandez had in the socialist dictator. This story may have been spun after his death to make him look like a ruler of the disciples. The title of king was said to be what Hernandez wanted to call himself. However, when he was alive, the title of king did not exist within the Latin disciples. That title was given to Hernandez after his death, and he was known as King Hitler. This also plays into the legends that Hernandez was a drug dealer and had his disciples selling lots of drugs while Hernandez took a taxed amount from each member. The truth is Hernandez was not even a dealer, and the disciples did not even start dealing drugs in high volume until years after his death. Hernandez did not even open any new territory during his years. Rockwell and Potomac was all there was between 1966 and 1972. And there was no Hirsch and Rockwell and no Latin scorpions mixed in with MLD history. Many of the original disciples left the gang after Hernandez was killed, and especially the vast majority were long gone by the late 1970s when the drug game became huge. Members of the Latin disciples and Milwaukee Kings got revenge for the killing of Hernandez. Even though there was no arrests made for the Hernandez murder, the streets knew which Latin king did it and revenge was given to that Latin king that was found dead later. There were no known arrests for that murder either. The Latin disciples were infuriated over the death of Hernandez, and it was the first time they would suffer the death of a leader. The Latin disciples then launched a full-scale war on the Latin kings led by their new leader Prince Diablo. Out of respect for Hitler, the title king died along with Hernandez, and at that point forward the new title would be Prince, and Prince Diablo was the first to carry this title until the late 1970s. As I stated a little earlier, a bond developed between Spanish Cobras and Latin disciples, and this led some disciples and Cobras to call themselves Almighty back in the early 1970s. The Latin lovers were also almighty when they formed in 1973, but this all was short-lived after the disciples started Maniac concepts for their senior members in 1973. In the year 1973, Pete the Burner Carrillo was arrested and supposedly thrown from the police station window. In his trial he cussed out the judge and said he was a maniac. Therefore, since 1973 the Maniac part of the name was born and Maniac concepts were created. The Latin disciples now had structure under Maniac, as members would start out as Pee-wee Latin disciples, then become young Latin disciples. Next they would become young future Latin disciples, then after that it was future Latin disciples. The final title was to become a Maniac, and they would then be Maniac Latin disciples. The violence between Latin kings and Latin disciples led to incarcerations of many Latin disciple members in the early 1970s, including co-founder Rudy Rios, who found himself in prison by 1974. In the year 1975 the Maniac Latin disciples expanded to a new neighborhood for the first time, opening the Erie and Wood chapter in the southern West Town area. In this new neighborhood MLDs fought heavily with C-notes as they allied with Satan disciples. In 1976, the Latin disciples and Spanish Cobras formed an alliance called Young Latino Organization, or YLO. Then in 1978 the unity was expanded to the Imperial Gangsters and Latin Eagles to form the United Latino Organization, or ULO, that reached other various clubs that hung out with them like Orchestra Albany. In the year 1976, the Maniac Latin disciples opened up territory at Avers and Division in the West Humboldt Park neighborhood, thus beginning the West Humboldt Park operations. April 1978 Larry Hoover sat down with the leaders of both allied gangs and enemy gangs in Stateville Correctional Facility and created the Folk Nation Alliance, while his enemies created the People Nation Alliance right then and there. It was at this meeting where the Latin disciples joined the Folk Nation, since they were already part of the Black Gangster Disciple Nation Alliance. Out of this folk nation unity was the Latin Familia, or Latin family, which was a unity of folks that would work to strengthen the Latino gangs involved in it, such as the Latin Disciples, Spanish Cobras, Satan Disciples, Imperial Gangsters, Latin Eagles, Ashland Vikings, Orchestra Albany, Ambrose and 2-6. This would end up helping the Latin disciples to expand their drug empire, especially now that they could walk the streets united with Simon City Royals, Spanish Cobras and Imperial Gangsters.